Every empire begins with a single moment when someone refuses to kneel. Not from arrogance, not from rage, from something quieter and far more dangerous, the knowledge that surrender, once given, cannot be taken back. Lady Seraphine Valor was 22 years old and standing barefoot in a palace courtyard at dawn, holding her ceremonial slippers in both hands, when she understood that the most treacherous border she would ever cross wasn't the one marked on any map. It was the one she was about to step across inside herself. Watch what happens when one woman chooses her own survival over every crown they've arranged for her. Stay until the end. I promise you, this story doesn't go where you think it's going. Drop your city in the comments right now, wherever you're watching from. Let's see how far this voice carries. Done. The fitting chamber smelled of pressed linen and cedar oil, and Seraphine had been standing on a low wooden platform for the better part of an hour, while 3 seamstresses worked in tight-lipped concentration around her hem. The wedding gown was ivory silk with gold threading at the collar. House Voss colors worked deliberately into the Eastern High Elder's bridal tradition, a visual statement stitched into the fabric itself before a single word of vow had been exchanged. Seraphine had noticed that detail within the first 30 seconds. She suspected she was the only one in the room who had. "Hold still, my lady," said the senior seamstress, a compact woman named Idra, who had dressed 3 generations of Valor women and who possessed the particular authority that comes from having pinned nobility's undergarments for decades. "You're breathing too shallow. It pulls the seam." "I'm breathing exactly as much as I need to." "For standing at an altar, you'll need more." Seraphine looked at the far wall rather than at her own reflection. There were tall windows in the fitting chamber, but they faced the interior courtyard, not the wilderness, and through the glass she could see the gardeners already at work along the stone paths, clipping hedges into shapes that pleased the family's eye, regardless of what the hedges themselves might have preferred. Her mother stood near the door with Councillor Pelwin, who was her father's political secretary, and who had the particular quality of always appearing to be listening to a conversation that wasn't audible to anyone else in the room. He was holding a leather folder and occasionally making small notes in it, which Seraphine found insulting in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "The Voss delegation arrives from the South Road," Pelwin said, not looking up from his folder. "Lord Darius has sent ahead a confirmation letter. He expects the ceremony completed before the autumn summit. His exact phrasing was, 'sealed before the summit opens so that every house understands the alliance is settled.'" Her mother made a small, satisfied sound. "As expected, Darius is a man who understands the value of certainty. He understands the value of owning things before anyone else can bid on them," Seraphine said. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the person speaking has said something that everyone understands to be true, but no one wanted named aloud. Edra kept working on the hem. She had the wisdom of someone who had lived through several generations of the Valor family's domestic dynamics and knew precisely when to become invisible. "Seraphine." Her mother's voice carried the warm, steel quality she deployed for corrections. "Darius Voss holds the southern frontier. His territory commands 3 river crossings. In a continental war, which every intelligence report your father receives suggests is coming within 3 years, those crossings are the difference between the Dominion holding its borders or watching them dissolve. I know what the crossings are worth." "Then you know what this marriage is worth." "I know what it costs." Seraphine finally looked at herself in the long mirror the seamstresses had positioned beside the platform, and she looked at herself with the same flat attention she might give a ledger. The ivory silk was beautiful. The gold threading was impeccable. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. "Those are 2 different numbers." Pelwin glanced up from his folder just briefly, with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very attentive. He wrote something in his notes. Her mother crossed the room and came to stand beside the mirror, close enough that Seraphine could smell the rosewater she used in her hair, and looked not at Seraphine but at Seraphine's reflection, as though it were somehow easier to speak to the image. "Every woman in our line has made this kind of choice," she said quietly. "Our line," Seraphine said, "has also buried 3 of its women before 40. The silence that followed was a different quality entirely. Edra finished the hempin. I'll need you to step down to check the fall, she said, in the tone of someone expertly clearing a room of its atmosphere. Seraphine stepped down. The marble was cold through the thin linen socks she wore, and she stood precisely long enough for Idra to assess the gown's drape against the floor, and then she said very calmly, "I need a moment in the garden," and walked toward the door. "The session isn't finished," Pelwin said. "The gown is nearly finished," Seraphine said. "I am not the gown." She was through the door before anyone formed a response worth delivering. What? The interior courtyard was formal and quiet at this hour. 2 guards stood at the far archway with the bored alertness of men who had been stationed there long enough to stop seeing clearly. The gardeners moved along the far path with their shears. Seraphine walked past the low hedges and the trimmed roses and the decorative fountain that had never been allowed to develop any moss because moss was considered untidy, and she walked until she reached the narrow side gate that the household staff used for deliveries, and she found it unlatched because the kitchen boy had propped it open for the morning bread delivery and had not yet returned to secure it. She stood at the open gate for a long moment. Beyond it was the east service road that curved around the estate's outer wall, and beyond that the lower fields, and beyond the lower fields the dark mass of the Veilthorn, which was what everyone in the Dominion called the wilderness that pressed against the Empire's eastern frontier, vast and old and supposedly dangerous, a place that maps described with increasing vagueness the deeper into its interior you looked. Every map of the Dominion treated the Veilthorn the same way, detailed up to the border, then a kind of cartographic shrug, regions labeled only as untamed territory, or claimed by no authority, or simply left blank with small printed warnings that the area was not surveyed and was not recommended. The Veilthorn smelled of pine resin and cold water and something deeper underneath that Seraphine had noticed since childhood, whenever the east wind came down from it, something dark and alive, and indifferent to everything the Dominion had built. She was still holding her ceremonial slippers. She looked down at them, ivory silk to match the gown, with gold thread, embroidered with the Voss family crest, because that detail had already been decided. She had not been consulted. The slippers had arrived 3 days ago in a gift box with Lord Darius's seal and a note in his handwriting that said simply, "For the ceremony, with my anticipation." She set the slippers neatly beside the gatepost. Then she walked barefoot through the open gate, across the service road, through the lower field's damp morning grass, and toward the tree line of the Veilthorn. She didn't run. Running would have been panic, and this wasn't panic. This was something more deliberate than panic, cooler and more final, the kind of decision that announces itself not with trembling but with an extraordinary steadiness, as though the body already knew before the mind caught up. She walked until the trees took her. The Veilthorn was different from the inside. She had expected it to feel threatening, the way rumors made it sound, oppressive and dark, full of hostile silences. Instead, it felt the way very old things feel when you encounter them without expectation. Massive and quiet and fundamentally uninterested in your presence. The trees here were older than the Dominion, older probably than any kingdom that had risen and fallen in this part of the continent. Their trunks were wide enough that 3 people standing arm to arm could not have encircled them, and their canopies filtered the early light into something diffuse and green and cool. Her feet found the ground carefully. She had walked barefoot in gardens her entire life, but gardens were managed, their stones smoothed and their paths cleared. This ground was alive in a different way. Roots and moss, and the soft give of years of accumulated leaf fall, occasional sharp edges of stone that required attention. She paid attention. It was something to do. She didn't know how long she walked, long enough that the sounds of the estate, the bells, the cartwheels on stone, the distant voices of the morning household, faded entirely. Long enough that the light changed angle. The hunger that arrived in her middle was useful because it told her it had been several hours, which meant the household would have noticed her absence, which meant decisions were already being made on her behalf, the way decisions always had been. She sat on a large flat root and rested her back against the trunk and looked up through the canopy at the small pieces of sky visible between branches. A bird called somewhere far up. The air tasted of resin and cold standing water. She thought about the slippers she had left beside the gate. That felt important. She hadn't taken them. She had set them down deliberately. Whatever she had walked into it without caring what she was supposed to be arriving at. The sound came without warning, not a crack of branch or rustle of undergrowth, more like the pressure of the air changing, a shift in the quality of the silence, the way water in a still pool changes when something large moves beneath its surface. She felt it before she heard anything concrete, some old animal instinct firing clean and bright. She stood up. The wolf was standing 20 feet away, watching her. It was the largest animal she had ever been in the presence of. Not large the way domesticated hounds were large, or the way the Dominion's war horses were large. Large in a way that existed outside the scale of anything she had a referent for, as though someone had taken the concept of wolf and extrapolated it into something that occupied a different category entirely. Silver gray, but the gray had undertones of something almost metallic in the filtered light, and its eyes were a color she would later struggle to describe. Pale, clear, the specific color of water over very old gray stone. It was not threatening her. It was watching her. There was a difference, and she felt it, though her body had flooded with the cold, bright chemistry of pure alarm regardless. She made herself breathe. One slow breath, deliberately measured. "I'm not moving quickly," she said, because saying something out loud felt less insane than standing there in complete silence. The wolf's ears shifted. "I'm not carrying anything worth taking," she continued in the same careful, measured tone. "I'm not armed. I'm barefoot." She glanced down at her feet as if confirming this for both of them. "Barefoot in the veil thorn, which I'm aware is not impressive." The wolf held her gaze. Something about the quality of its attention was unsettling in a way she couldn't quite place. Too specific, too intelligent, too comprehending. Then it turned and walked away between the trees, but stopped after about 15 feet and looked back at her. She understood. She was not sure how she understood, but she understood. "You want me to follow you," she said. The wolf waited. She followed. The camp existed in a natural clearing where several massive trees had fallen long ago and left a bowl of open space perhaps 60 feet across, their rotting trunks now supporting a dense layer of undergrowth that formed a natural wall on 3 sides. Someone had made fire at the center and built a rough lean-to of cut branches along the 4th side, and there were 3 horses picketed to the east, and 2 men standing when she arrived, hands near but not on their weapons, watching her with the professional alertness of soldiers who had been trained to treat surprise as a category rather than a reaction. The 3rd man was crouching near the fire. He stood as she entered the clearing, and the silver wolf moved past her and settled at the edge of the space with the ease of something returning to its own territory. He was tall, not unusually so, but with the proportioned density of someone who carried strength without performing it, the way a load-bearing wall doesn't announce itself but makes itself evident the moment you put weight on it. Dark hair, the kind of dark that's nearly black, pushed back from his face without care. His clothes were traveling clothes, worn and functional, the leather of his jacket soft with long use. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and old, following the line of the bone, and his hands, she noticed immediately, were rough in the way that comes from actual work rather than affectation. His eyes were very dark and entirely awake. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they find interesting rather than at a problem they find inconvenient, and she was not sure whether that distinction was a good sign or a worse one. "You followed my wolf," he said. "She invited me," Seraphine said. A short silence, and then something in his expression shifted by a very small degree. Not quite a smile, but the nearest neighborhood of it. "She," he said. It felt appropriate. "She walked with more patience than most escorts I've had." The 2 soldiers exchanged a fast glance that they managed to make very small. The tall man looked at her for a long moment, then moved toward the fire and crouched again, picking up a short-bladed knife and returning to what she now saw was a piece of meat he'd been preparing, cutting it with the methodical patience of someone not inclined to rush. "You're barefoot," he said. "Several people have noted that this morning. Most people in the Veilthorn have the sense to be frightened. I had a more frightening morning before I got here." She said it without dramatics, the way you say true things. "The wolf doesn't frighten me." She was deliberate. Deliberate things don't frighten me as much as they should. He set the knife down and looked up at her fully. There was an attention to it that felt like assessment rather than judgment, the difference being that assessment still holds the possibility of surprise. What does frighten you? She met his eyes directly. Becoming someone I don't recognize. He held the look for 3 seconds. She counted, because counting was something to do with the part of her brain that was currently running threat calculations on this entire situation. Then he looked back at the fire, and his voice when he spoke again was level in a way that didn't perform levelness, just was it. Sit down. Your feet need rest. I don't know who you are. You're in my camp and you've been walking for hours. Sit down. She sat down on one of the flat stones near the fire, because her feet did in fact need rest, and because she had run out of performance energy somewhere around the 2nd hour of walking, and the situation had stopped being about performance anyway. The fire was warm on the bottoms of her feet. She looked at them and saw that the morning's walk had left her soles dark with earth, and marked here and there with small cuts that stung now that she was still. My name is Seraphine Valor, she said. My father is High Elder Kadeen Valor of the Eastern Dominion. She said it plainly, watching for the reaction, because the reaction was information. He didn't startle. He didn't recalibrate his posture. He simply continued working on the meat and said, I know. The air in the clearing changed. Then you knew before your wolf found me. The wolf found you on her own. My knowledge of you came from other sources. He glanced up briefly. There is a political wedding being prepared in the Valor estate right now. A daughter of the Eastern High Elder being given to Lord Darius Voss of the Southern Frontier. It has been discussed in every court briefing in the region for the past 8 months. Your name is not unknown. Seraphine looked at the fire. The 2 soldiers had resumed their posts near the lean-to, far enough to be polite about pretending not to listen. That's the wedding I walked away from, she said. I gathered. You're not going to tell me to go back. No, he said. Most men in your position would. Most men in my position are not me. She looked at him again with the specific sharpness she used when deciding whether to believe something. He didn't deflect from it. He just looked back and let the looking happen. Who are you? She asked. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the trees above, the bird called again, 2 notes, the same as before. Ronan Ashraven, he said. She had been trained since childhood not to let information register on her face before she chose to let it register. It was a skill her mother had taught her before she was 10, and it was as automatic now as breathing. She used it. She managed, she was fairly certain, 1 full second of smooth expression before her face did what it did, which was not collapse exactly, but settle into something very still, the stillness of a surface when something very large has just moved beneath it. King Alpha Ronan Ashraven, she said. You can leave off the title. We're sitting in a clearing. You're the sovereign of the Ashraven Empire. Among other things. Your empire borders ours to the north. And to the northeast, 240 miles of shared border depending on how you measure the Kelith River's last 40 miles, which is disputed. He moved the meat off the fire with the ease of someone who had been cooking over campfires for a long time. Are you going to run? No. She said it immediately and was surprised by the immediacy, but it was true. The thought of running hadn't occurred to her. What had occurred to her was the information itself, laying itself out in her mind with the clarity of cold water. Ronan Ashraven, 29 years old, sovereign for 4 years following his father's death, commander of the largest military force on the continent, owner of a reputation that traveled ahead of him like weather. Ruthless in battle. Fair in governance, according to intelligence reports she had actually read because she had made herself read every intelligence report that passed through her father's study. Unmarried, no documented heirs. And here, in the Veilthorn, without an army. What are you doing in the forest? She asked. The same thing I do in every situation where I need to understand something before I commit to it, he said, looking with my own eyes. Looking at what? He handed her a piece of the meat on a flat piece of bark. She took it because she was hungry and because refusing food in this situation felt like the kind of performance she no longer had the energy for. At the eastern frontier, he said. At the Dominion's border situation. At whether the terrain matches the maps, and whether the intelligence I've been given matches the reality. He settled back on his heels and looked at her directly. I came here to evaluate whether your father's domain makes a viable ally for what is coming. The Continental War. My father believes the same thing is coming. Most intelligent people who've looked at the northern movements do. He ate a piece of meat with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone accustomed to eating in field conditions. The Dominion has defensible river crossings, trade infrastructure, internal stability, which is rarer than it sounds. What it lacks is a military force with enough weight to hold a northern front against the kind of coordinated assault that's being organized. What the Ashravan Empire lacks, Seraphine said carefully, is regional allies. You have the military weight. You don't have the flanking support. If you're extended on a northern front and the Western lords decide to test your eastern flank simultaneously, you're fighting two directions at once. He looked at her. The intelligence reports passed through my father's study, she said. I made myself familiar with them. Your father knows you read them? My father assumes many things about which rooms his daughter spends time in. She looked at the piece of meat she was holding, then ate some of it. It was well seasoned. He had been cooking in the field for a long time. So you came to evaluate the Dominion as an alliance prospect. You intended to approach my father. I intended to evaluate first. Alliance propositions are easier to make when you know the ground. His voice was even. I hadn't anticipated the ground including a barefoot noblewoman running from a political wedding. I wasn't running, she said, with more emphasis than she'd intended. The small thing near a smile appeared in his expression again, briefly. No, he said, and the concession sounded genuine. You weren't running, you were walking, with considerable purpose. Yes. She looked into the fire. The warmth of it was reaching through her feet now, spreading up through her tired legs. Something about the sensation was honest in a way the fitting chamber had not been. Simple and direct, fire giving heat, body receiving it, no ceremony required. What happens if I return you to your family estate? He said, not as a question but as the opening of a thought. The wedding proceeds. The alliance with Voss is sealed. The river crossings are secured through marriage contract. Yes. And you spend the rest of your considerable years as the Southern Lord's political asset. She didn't answer because the answer was self-evident, and they both knew it, and she had learned from long practice that confirming self-evident things out loud is usually for the benefit of someone who needs convincing, not someone who already knows. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. I'm going to offer you sanctuary for the remainder of today, Sherti said. My men will not speak of your presence here. When the day ends, you decide where you go. She looked at him. Why? Because you walked into the Vale Thorn barefoot this morning rather than allow someone to put you in slippers embroidered with another man's crest, he said, with the flat evenness of someone reciting a fact. A person willing to do that is not someone who benefits from being handled. And you are no use to me as a political asset if you have already been broken by someone else's handling. The fire popped. No use to you, she said. I said what I said. You haven't met me. You don't know my capacity. No, he agreed, but I know the capacity of a woman who walks into the Vile Thorn in the pre-dawn quiet without shoes, and who follows a wolf through old-growth forest with more composure than most trained soldiers show. And I know that composure is not common. He looked at her steadily. I also know that the Dominion's alliance is worth less to me without the participation of someone who actually understands what the alliance is for. My father makes the Dominion's political decisions. Your father makes them for now, Ronan said. Your father is 58 years old and has no sons and has one daughter who read every intelligence report that came through his study. She felt something move through her chest at that. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, the particular sensation of being seen by someone who has no reason to perform understanding and is therefore probably experiencing the actual thing. She looked away from him, back at the fire. One day, she said. One day. And then I decide. And then you decide. Around her, the Vale Thorn breathed its old deep breath. Somewhere far above them, the canopy moved in a breeze she couldn't feel at ground level. The wolf had settled near the edge of the clearing with her head on her paws, watching the tree line with the patient attention of something that had never confused vigilance with anxiety. Seraphine had not known, walking through that kitchen gate with the dawn cold on her bare feet, where she was going. She had known only what she was walking away from, and she had trusted, with the specific desperate logic of someone who has run out of alternatives, that walking away from one thing was enough of a beginning. She hadn't expected the forest to have an answer waiting for her. She hadn't expected the answer to be a king sitting in a clearing, cooking meat on a campfire, with a silver wolf who had looked at her and apparently decided she was worth collecting. She hadn't expected to feel, for the first time in months, like the most honest version of herself. The day passed the way honest days pass, simply and with the quality of being fully present in each piece of it. He showed her the veil thorn through his eyes, which was to say, he moved through it with the particular confidence of someone who had spent enough time in hostile territory to understand that hostility is mostly a matter of preparation. He knew which plants were edible and which were toxic, and how to tell the difference not by sight alone but by the smell and the texture of the leaf. He knew where the water ran cleanest and how to read the animal tracks that marked the soil near the stream. His two soldiers, whose names were Bren and Kyle, maintained a respectful distance but were clearly attentive in the way professionals are attentive, present but not intrusive. He asked her questions. Not the questions she was accustomed to, not questions about her family connections or her dowry or her willingness to relocate to the southern frontier. He asked what she had found in the intelligence reports that her father's counselors had apparently not considered worth acting on. He asked how she assessed the Dominion's internal alliances, the Alpha Lords who paid tribute, and whether that tribute came from loyalty or fear. He asked what she thought the northern movements were actually trying to accomplish, because strategy wasn't just about the force being assembled, but about what the force was for. She answered him directly. It felt strange at first, the directness. She was accustomed to the Dominion's court language, all of it filtered through layers of courtesy that were actually layers of protection, so that nothing you said could be held against you, and nothing you said actually meant anything. This was not like that. He asked, she answered. He listened without the slight delay that people use when they're formulating their response before you finish speaking. He actually listened. You believe the Northern Force isn't after territorial expansion, he said, near midday, when they were sitting near the stream and the water was moving fast and cold over gray stones. I believe territorial expansion is the visible goal and therefore probably not the primary one, she said. The Northern Lords don't need more territory. They have more territory than they can effectively administer. What they need is disruption. They need the existing continental order to become unstable enough that the current power distribution breaks apart, because they can't improve their position through conventional negotiation. They can only improve it if the board resets entirely. He was quiet for a moment. Your father's counselors have concluded it's a territorial campaign. My father's counselors are good at their jobs. Their job is to advise on the Dominion's immediate interests, which is a territorial question. The strategic layer underneath that is outside their brief. She watched the water. I wrote a summary of my analysis last spring. I put it on my father's desk. It wasn't raised in any subsequent meeting I was aware of. Because you're his daughter. Because I'm his daughter, and my function in the Dominion's political structure has been identified as marital rather than advisory. She said it without heat. The heat had burned out of it months ago, replaced by something colder and more durable. Which is a waste of an analysis. Yes, he said, in the tone of someone agreeing with a mathematical proof. It is. And then he said something she would return to for a long time afterward, not because it was elaborately phrased, but because it was the opposite. Because it was so plain it shouldn't have mattered and somehow mattered enormously. You should be at the table. 3 words, not a compliment. A statement of logistics, delivered with the same matter-of-fact conviction he used to describe which plants were edible. She should be at the table the way the Kelith River should be properly mapped. Because the information was there, and not using it was simply inefficient. She didn't say anything. He didn't appear to require her to. By late afternoon, the light through the canopy had gone golden and horizontal, the way it gets in the final hours before dark, when the sun has dropped below the highest point of the sky, and the world goes briefly amber and still. They were back at the camp. Bren and Kale had built up the fire. The wolf had been asleep near the lean-to for the past 2 hours in the dense, unconcerned way large animals sleep when they feel entirely safe. "Tell me about Darius Voss," Ronan said. "What do you want to know?" "What the intelligence reports don't say." She thought about it for a moment. "He's effective. He holds the southern frontier because he's good at holding things, not because he builds loyalty, but because he removes alternatives." She chose each word with care. "His subordinates follow him because following him is the best available option, not because they'd choose him in an open field." "And as a husband." "As a husband," she said, and the word had a dry edge she didn't try to file off, "he would be effective in the same way. I would be held. Alternatives would be removed." She looked at the fire. "I would be very safe." "Is that what you want?" "I want to be at the table," she said, and didn't look away from the fire when she said it, because looking at the fire made it possible to say it simply, without the performance of confession. "I want to spend my intelligence on something that matters. I want the years I have to count for something beyond the political utility of my bloodline." The fire moved. "Then you know what returning means," he said. "Yes." "And you know what not returning means." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "The Dominion will try to retrieve you. My father will. It's not personal, it's logistics. My men can return you safely to the estate border at first light. I know. Or you can make a different decision." She looked at him then. He was looking at the fire and not at her, which she understood was a specific courtesy, giving her room to think without the pressure of being watched. She thought about the slippers, the gold Voss crest embroidered into ivory silk before she had agreed to anything, the seamstresses who had not been told to ask her opinion, Pelwin writing in his folder, her mother looking at her reflection rather than her face. She thought about the day she had just spent in this clearing and along this stream, being asked questions no one had asked her before and being heard when she answered. She thought about what Ronan Ashravan had said, plainly and without sentiment, as though it were simply true. "You should be at the table." "If I return," she said slowly, "and the wedding proceeds, what happens to the alliance you came to evaluate?" He looked at her then. "I would approach your father through conventional channels, a formal proposition, trade rights, military support, the standard framework. And the chance of success? Lower, direct, no decoration. Your father values this arrangement with Voss. Disrupting it without significant leverage is difficult. The Dominion has alternatives. Voss is not the only option on the map. If the match dissolved, your father would move to the next name on his list. He would not necessarily choose me. But if I—" She stopped. "If you chose to return to this forest," he said carefully, "the wedding cannot proceed. And your father, faced with the collapse of one arrangement and the need to rebuild his political position, would be more receptive to a direct approach from the empire that had, one might say, indirectly made the previous arrangement impossible." "That is a very careful way of saying what you're saying." "I'm being careful because it is your life," he said, with a weight that was not theatrical, "and because I do not want to be another person who decides what your life is for." The amber light had faded. The fire was the primary light now, and in firelight everything looks both simpler and more serious than it does in daylight, stripped of all the middle distances. She looked at her bare feet, still marked with the morning's walk, warm now from the fire's warmth. She thought of the wolf, who had looked at her in the forest at dawn and decided, on whatever basis wolves decide things, that she was worth leading somewhere. She was about to speak when Cale, the younger of the two soldiers, made a sharp sound from the edge of the clearing. Every person in the camp went still. Bren was already on his feet, hand on the short sword at his hip. Ronan stood with the particular quality of readiness that doesn't rush itself, looking toward the eastern tree line. The wolf had come awake from dead sleep to fully alert in the span of a breath, standing at the camp's edge with her ears sharp and forward and her whole attention focused on something in the dark beyond the trees. Seraphine stood. "How many?" Ronan said very quietly. 8, Cale said. "No, 12. 2 formations, coming from the north track and the deer path." "Torchlight?" "Not yet." "Riders or foot?" Riders, well-equipped. Kale's voice was clipped, professional. Dominion colors. Seraphine felt the cold come through her clearly, not fear exactly, but recognition. The same cold, clear recognition she'd felt that morning at the gate, but inverted. The morning had been a door opening. This was a door about to close. Her father's men had found her. They moved fast. Her family's hunters, who knew this territory's edge better than she had assumed, who had apparently tracked her further into the Veilthorn than anyone in the Dominion was supposed to venture. 12 riders. Well-equipped, which meant her father had not sent a search party. He had sent a retrieval force. Ronan turned to look at her. His expression was entirely level, and there was something in that levelness that she understood was a specific form of respect. He was not going to make this decision for her. He was not going to sweep her up and carry her into the dark or hand her over to the riders, or do any of the 50 things a man in his position could have reasoned were expedient. He was going to let her be the one who chose. In the 20 seconds before the first rider's torchlight began to filter through the trees at the clearing's eastern edge, Seraphine Valor looked at the king who had spent a day asking her questions and listening to the answers, and at the silver wolf standing between them and the darkness with her steady animal certainty, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water on her bare feet on the morning's cold ground, that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was exactly what she had done at dawn. Be deliberate. She turned to Ronan. When they enter the clearing, she said, I need you to say nothing. I will speak. He held her gaze for a moment, one slow, assessing breath. All right, he said. The first torch broke through the tree line, and behind it, on a dark horse with the Valor crest on his breastplate, came Captain Aldrich, her father's most trusted officer, who had been at every major decision of her family's life since before she was born, and who now looked at her across the campfire with an expression that contained in equal measure relief at finding her alive and the particular professional regret of someone who has been given a task they do not personally enjoy. Lady Seraphine, he said, pulling his horse to a stop. His eyes moved across the camp, the two soldiers, the fire, the wolf, and then settled on Ronan with the careful attention of a man who has just recognized something significant. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear. Calculation. My lady, your father requests your immediate return. 11 other riders had fanned into the clearing behind him, torches lit now, and the clearing that had been firelit and private was now a stage, every face visible, every position a statement. Seraphine stood in her bare feet in the firelight and looked at Captain Aldrich. Tell my father, she said, with the calm of someone who has already made the decision before the words come, that I am not available. Aldrich's expression moved through something she couldn't quite name. My lady, tell him also, she said, and her voice was steady and level and entirely hers, that I am in conversation with King Alpha Ronan Ashravan of the Ashravan Empire, and that the conversation concerns an alliance that has implications for the entire Dominion. She let that land. Tell him I will return when the conversation is complete, and that I will return with terms. The clearing was silent except for the fire and the horses breathing. Aldrich looked at her. Then slowly he looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing because she had asked him to say nothing, and he had said all right. He looked at Aldrich with the particular quality of a man who is not performing patience because he does not need to perform it. Aldrich straightened in his saddle. His jaw moved slightly. Then he said very carefully, And if your father insists on your immediate return? Seraphine met his eyes with everything she had. Then, she said, he will need to insist to my face. The silence stretched, and in that silence 12 riders and 2 soldiers and a wolf and 1 king all waited to see what a barefoot woman would do next. And none of them, not even the man who had spent a day treating her as though her mind was worth consulting, not even the wolf who had decided she was worth collecting from the forest floor. None of them were entirely sure, which was, she realized, exactly where she needed to be. The silence in the clearing had weight, not the comfortable silence of the forest at rest, which Seraphine had spent all day learning to read. This was a pressure silence, the kind that exists between a drawn bowstring and a released one. Every person in the space aware that the next sound would determine the shape of everything that followed. Captain Aldrich sat his horse and looked at her. He was 53 years old and had served her father for 26 of those years. And in that time, Seraphine had watched him negotiate hostage situations, deliver death notices to noble families, and once talk three armed men down from a barricade using nothing but his voice and an extraordinary patience. He was not a man who rattled, but he was rattled now, in the specific way of someone whose operational parameters have just been exceeded. Not by force, but by a situation that the parameters were never written to include. He looked at Ronan again. Longer this time. Cataloging. She watched him do the math. The traveling clothes, the campfire, the two soldiers who carried themselves like veterans rather than guards, the silver wolf who had not moved from the camp's edge and who was watching the riders with an attention that was not threatening but was the specific opposite of afraid. And then the man himself. No crown, no armor, no performance of authority whatsoever, and therefore harder to dismiss than any of those things would have made him. Aldrich's jaw moved again. King Ashravan, he said, and the title came out careful and flat, testing the weight of it. Ronan said, Captain. One word, no inflection. Aldrich absorbed that. He looked back at Seraphine with an expression that had shifted from professional regret to something she read as genuine conflict. A man who understood now that the situation had acquired consequences that extended well beyond a retrieval order, and who was smart enough to know that the wrong move in the next 30 seconds would echo for years. My lady, he said, your father's orders are specific. My father's orders assume specific circumstances, Seraphine said. The circumstances have changed. The High Elder will not consider that a satisfying answer. The High Elder is not here, she said. You are. And you are smart enough to know that dragging the daughter of the Eastern High Elder out of a conversation with the sovereign of the Ashravan Empire is not a retrieval. It is an incident. She watched that land. Watched him do the second calculation, faster than the first. I need to send a rider back, he said finally. Then send one. Aldrich turned his head and spoke a name low to the man on his right, who wheeled his horse and was back through the trees within seconds, the sound of hooves fading fast into the dark. 11 riders remaining. The torches lit the clearing orange and unsteady, making shadows jump at the edges. Ronan had not moved. He stood beside the fire with his hands loose at his sides and the entirety of his attention on Aldrich, not as a challenge, but as a form of patience that was, in its own way, more unsettling than a challenge would have been. He was waiting. He was clearly prepared to wait considerably longer. It was Bren, behind her and slightly left, who moved first, not aggressively, just to a different position, a shift of weight that happened to place him between two of the riders and the camp's interior. Cale had done the same on the other side without appearing to. Small adjustments, professional. Aldrich noted them. He was too experienced not to. We'll camp at the tree line, he said to Seraphine, and his voice had shifted to the register he used when he was managing a situation rather than concluding one. Until the High Elder sends further instruction. That's your choice, she said. My lady. He paused. Something moved behind his eyes that she thought might have been, for just a moment, something close to respect. Be careful with what you're doing. I know what I'm doing, she said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she said it the way her mother had taught her to say things she needed to be true, which was the same way you say things you already believe, with your shoulders level and your breath steady and no distance between the words and your body. Aldrich held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned his horse and led his riders back to the tree line, and the clearing went back to firelight and forest. Ronan crouched by the fire and added a piece of wood to it. The normalcy of the gesture was deliberate, she thought, a signal that the temperature of the situation did not require them to perform crisis. You handled that well, he said. I handled it the way I needed to, she said. Whether it was well depends on what my father sends back. What will he send back? She sat back down on the flat stone, because her legs had been steady through the confrontation, and she wanted to let them rest now that they didn't have to be. Depends on who he talks to first. She pressed her palms against her knees. If he talks to my mother first, she'll tell him to wait and think. If he talks to Pelwyn first, Pelwin will send another 20 riders and a formal extraction order. And if he thinks for himself first, then he'll want to know what Ronan Ashravan is doing in the Veilthorn and whether it's a threat or an opportunity. She looked at him. My father is a political animal above all else. His instincts, even when they frustrate me, are generally accurate. He'll see that this situation has two possible readings, and he'll want to know which one it is before he commits to either. And which one is it? Ronan asked, looking at her directly. She met the look. You already know which one you intend. I know my intentions, he said. I don't speak for yours. It was a quiet statement, and it carried a great deal, and she sat with it for a moment the way you sit with something that has been said precisely rather than impressively. I told Aldrich I was in a conversation with you, she said. I told him I would return with terms. You did? I don't know what terms I have to offer. You have yourself, he said, and the word carried none of the freight she expected. No performance, no meaning layered under it. Just a plain logistics fact, delivered the same way he'd talked about river crossings and border terrain. You have your analysis of the Dominion's internal politics. You have your father's ear, or you will when this is over, in a way that a foreign envoy does not. You have the credibility that comes from being the person who stopped a political wedding in the middle of the Veilthorn with 12 armed riders watching. He added another piece of wood to the fire. That is not nothing. It's not a treaty. No, but it's the beginning of one. She was quiet, looking at the fire, letting the warmth work on her from the outside while something cooler and more insistent worked on her from the inside. The thing she had been aware of all day but had not allowed herself to name directly, because naming it required facing it, and facing it required accepting that the morning's walk through the gate had been not just a refusal, but a direction, that she hadn't just walked away from the slippers, but towards something she hadn't had a word for yet. What would you want, she said slowly, if this became something? If you approach my father, what would the Ashravan Empire actually need from the Dominion? He looked at her. I mean, specifically, she said, not the diplomatic version, the actual version. He considered for a moment, not the considering of someone deciding what to reveal, but someone deciding where to start. The 3 river crossings in the South Frontier. Not ownership. Access rights guaranteed in writing, in perpetuity, with the Dominion's military obligation to hold them if the Empire needs them held. He paused. The trade routes through the Eastern Passage open to Ashravan merchants at the same tariff rate as Dominion domestic traffic. My father's merchants will fight that. Your father's merchants are not fighting a continental war. They are in their way. She tilted her head. What else? A seat at every Dominion intelligence briefing that concerns northern movements, not a courtesy invitation, an actual seat with actual information. She breathed. And in exchange, military, full weight. If the northern assault comes, the Ashravan Empire commits its forces to the Dominion's defense as a primary obligation, not a secondary one. Not after we've secured our own border, first. He looked at the fire. Trade resources. Grain surplus from the western provinces, iron from the mountain territories, and the diplomatic weight of an Ashravan alliance, which changes every political calculation on the continent. She was quiet for a moment. That's a serious offer. It's what I came to the Veilthorn to evaluate whether to make. And have you evaluated? He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not the level evenness of professional assessment, but something slightly warmer and slightly more complicated than that, though it didn't surface long before the evenness came back, like a depth charge that briefly breaks the surface and then disappears without explaining itself. I've gathered sufficient information, he said. She thought about what that meant and decided not to pursue it directly because some things need space to sit before they can be pressed. If I go back to my father, she said, and I tell him what you've told me tonight, the specific terms, he'll want to meet with you. That's the outcome I'd prefer. He'll also want to know why you were negotiating through his daughter instead of through formal channels. He'll want to know, Ronan said, because the question will matter to him politically. His counselors will use it against the arrangement if they can. They'll say the King Alpha approached an unmarried noblewoman in an unsupervised forest and that the arrangement lacks propriety. Yes, she said flatly. What would you tell him? She looked at the fire and thought about it honestly. I'd tell him that the King Alpha of the Ashravan Empire could have returned me to the estate boundary at first light and chosen to approach through formal channels, and that he'd have had a slower and less certain negotiation, and that instead he granted me sanctuary for a day and asked me questions about the Dominion's political structure, and listened to my analysis of the northern movements and told me I should be at the table. She paused. And that every king before him who's ever spoken to me has talked to my bloodline. He talked to me. The fire crackled. That, she said, is either a very sophisticated diplomatic strategy or it is something simpler, and I'm not sure which one it is. He said nothing for a long moment. The wolf shifted near the edge of the clearing, settling into a different position, her tail curling around her forepaws. Both things can be true, Ronan said finally. She looked at him. His expression was the same even quality it had been all day, and she understood now that it wasn't flatness. It was the stillness of someone who had learned that in most situations, saying less was more honest than saying more, because more gave people what they wanted to hear rather than what was accurate. If I go back, she said, and felt the weight of the conditional as she said it, felt what it contained, I'm walking back into an arrangement that may still be salvageable from Voss's perspective. My father may still push for the original match. Pelwyn will argue that the alliance with Voss is already too far committed to be abandoned without political damage. Yes. And you have no leverage over that outcome. You can offer better terms, but you can't force my father to take them. No, he said, I can't. So I am returning on the possibility that my father is, as I said, a political animal whose instincts are generally accurate, and that he will recognize what's on the table. Yes, she breathed slowly, and if he doesn't? He looked at her, held it. Then you'll have gone back for nothing, and I'll have approached through formal channels and had the slower negotiation anyway. And the wedding with Voss. And the wedding with Voss, he confirmed, without flinching. She sat with that, sat with the plain fact of it, which was that he was not offering her rescue, not in any theatrical sense. He was offering her a real option with a real uncertainty attached, because real options always had uncertainty attached, and anyone who said otherwise was selling something. She had known this morning, walking through that gate, that she did not want to be sold to. She had not entirely expected to spend the day being offered a genuine choice by someone with no obligation to give her one. I'll go back at first light, she said. He nodded. Once. I'll need something to bring him, she said, something concrete, not just my account of what you said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket and produced a small, flat case, opened it, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He held it out. She took it and unfolded it. It was a summary, handwritten in a compact, very clear hand. 3 paragraphs. Alliance terms, exactly as he had spoken them, with one addition at the bottom that he had not said aloud. In the matter of all negotiation, the Ashravan Empire requests the presence of Lady Seraphine Valor as a participating party, not a subject of negotiation. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and held it. You wrote this before tonight, she said. I wrote it this afternoon, he said, after the stream. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish what the statement already contained. He had written it after the conversation at the stream, after she had told him about the intelligence report that had sat unread on her father's desk. After you should be at the table. She held the paper in both hands and looked at the fire and felt very clearly the sensation she associated with a decision already made. Not the drama of making it, but the stillness that comes after, when the body catches up to what the mind completed 3 steps back. I'll sleep here tonight, she said. At first light, I'll go to Aldrich. There are blankets in the lean-to, he said, with the same practical ease he'd used about the meat, about the stream, about the edible plants. No ceremony. She nodded. She stood and walked to the lean-to, where a folded wool blanket sat on the dry-packed earth. She pulled it around her shoulders and sat back against the slanted wall of cut branches and looked out at the fire from there, at Ronan's profile as he maintained the fire in the way of someone who had sat fire watch many times and found it neither tedious nor romantic, just a task that needed doing. She thought about what she was carrying back. Not just the paper, though the paper was real and concrete and would do work that her spoken word could not. Something harder to name. The memory of a day in which she had been spoken to as though her thinking mattered, in which the questions had been real and the listening had been real, in which no one had called her position as a daughter a limitation or a waste, but had simply proceeded as though it were neither of those things. She thought about the slippers by the gate and the 22 years of measuring her worth in terms of other people's requirements. She thought about the wolf finding her in the forest at dawn. She thought about what it meant that she had followed. Across the fire, Ronan's voice came quiet and without announcement. "You're not going to sleep." "No," she admitted. "That's all right." He added one more piece of wood to the fire. "Neither am I." They kept the fire through the night without much speech, the way people keep vigil when they understand that the morning will change things and there is nothing left to do but be present, while the hours move through their last quiet paces. At some point, Bren took over the watch and Kale slept, and the wolf moved from the clearing's edge to the space between the fire and the lean-to, and settled there with her usual unconcerned gravity, and the veilthorn breathed its old deep breath around all of them. Seraphine did not sleep. She sat with the folded paper and the wool blanket and the warmth of the fire, and she made herself look clearly at what morning would hold. Boss, the riders came back at dawn. Not Aldrich's riders. New ones, faster horses, the Valor crest on full formal display, and in the lead not a captain but her father's first counselor Hadwin, who was 60 years old and had the particular political intelligence of someone who has survived 3 different high elders by understanding before anyone else which way the situation was actually tilting. He pulled his horse up at the clearing's edge and looked at the camp and at Seraphine standing outside the lean-to with the blanket still around her shoulders and the folded paper in her hand. Then he looked at Ronan, who was standing near the fire, and his expression went through several things quickly before arriving at a careful stillness. "My lady Seraphine," Hadwin said, "the High Elder requests an immediate audience." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm coming." He looked at Ronan again. "King Ashravan." Ronan inclined his head. The exact degree of inclination was a statement in itself, acknowledging the address without deferring to it. Hadwin absorbed this carefully. He had the quality of someone who had learned to receive information without reacting visibly to it, and he was working that quality very hard in this moment. "The High Elder," Hadwin said, and his voice was precise and entirely without color, "will want to know the nature of the conversation that has taken place here." "The nature of the conversation," Seraphine said, stepping forward, "is an alliance proposition with implications for the Dominion's survival in a continental war. My father will receive the terms when I present them to him in person." She held up the folded paper. "Formally, with a participating seat for myself at the table." Hadwin's eyes moved from the paper to her face to Ronan and back. Something shifted deeply behind his careful stillness. Not opposition, she noted. Recalculation. "And Lord Darius Voss," Hadwin said quietly. "He arrives at the estate today." The words hung in the morning air between them. Seraphine looked at Hadwin and let the silence stretch for exactly the amount of time it needed to. "Then we shouldn't keep my father waiting," she said. She crossed the clearing without looking back, because looking back would have been a performance, and she had stopped performing approximately 1 day ago in a forest with a fire and a king who asked real questions. But at the tree line, the wolf was there. She had moved from inside the clearing to the forest's edge without anyone seeing her cross the space, the way large things move when they want to move without being marked doing it. She stood in the gap between 2 massive trunks and looked at Seraphine with those pale, clear eyes, and Seraphine stopped. She looked back just once at Ronan standing by the fire. He was watching her go. And what she read in his face in that single backward look was not the calculated patience of a diplomatic transaction, not the professional satisfaction of a negotiation moving in the right direction. What she read was something quieter and more unguarded than either of those things. The expression of a man who has understood something about a situation that extends beyond the immediate terms, and who is choosing, with considerable deliberateness, not to act on it yet. She turned back to the tree line. The wolf stepped aside. And Seraphine Valor walked toward her father's house, with the folded paper in her hand and the morning cold on her bare feet. And Lord Darius Voss's horses were already visible on the south road in the far distance. And by tonight her father would have heard her out and made his first move. And by tonight there would be no version of the future that looked anything like it had looked yesterday morning. She had known, walking through the kitchen gate at dawn, that she was stepping across something she could not step back across. She had not known, until this moment, how completely she had meant it. The South Road dust rose in the distance. The Voss banners caught the early light. She kept walking. The South Road dust was still rising when Seraphine walked through the estate's front gate. Not the kitchen gate. The front gate, which was the statement she intended. She had left barefoot through a side door, and she was returning through the main entrance with First Counselor Hadwin's formal escort and 12 riders at her back, and anyone watching from the estate's upper windows, which several people certainly were, would note the difference. Her feet were filthy. Her hair had come mostly loose from yesterday morning's arrangement. She was wearing the same dress she had worn to the fitting chamber, now carrying a full day and night of forest floor, and she was holding a folded piece of paper in her right hand with the deliberateness of someone carrying something that matters. She walked like she was supposed to be there. She had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother, who had apparently learned it from circumstances that no one in the family spoke about directly. The fundamental lesson that your body's confidence is the first argument you make, before a single word, and that the argument has to be made even when, especially when, every other signal is working against you. The estate's receiving hall was crowded in the particular way of political crisis. Too many people who had each decided individually that their presence was necessary, all of them performing some version of controlled urgency. Household staff moving faster than usual. 2 of her father's military advisors in the corridor, looking at documents they probably weren't actually reading. Pelwin near the inner door with his leather folder, as always, and an expression that had moved past professional neutrality into something tighter and more personal. He looked at her feet first, then the paper, then her face. "Your father is in the war room," he said. "Of course he is," she said, and kept walking. Das son. High Elder Caden Vaylor was not a large man, but he had the quality of occupying space precisely and fully, the way a well-placed stone occupies its position in a wall, not through size but through fit, through the impression that removing him would cause a collapse in the surrounding structure. He was standing at the long table when she came in, maps spread across it, 2 senior military advisors beside him, and he looked up when the door opened and looked at her with the expression she knew best from him, the one that contained simultaneously genuine love and complete political ruthlessness, the 2 things coexisting in him the way they did in all the people who had built something real out of hard circumstances. "Leave us," he said to the advisors, without taking his eyes off her. They left. The door closed. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way he rarely had time to do, taking in the forest dirty dress and the bare feet and the paper in her hand. Something moved behind his eyes that she thought, briefly, might have been the same thing she'd felt in the clearing when Ronan had said you should be at the table. The same sensation of being actually seen rather than assessed for utility. Then it passed. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," she said. Not defiant, just accurate about what she needed in this moment, which was her feet on the floor and her spine straight. He breathed through his nose. "You spent the night in the Vialthorn with Ronan Ashravan." "Yes." "With 2 of his soldiers and no escort of your own." "Yes." Seraphine pressed his hands flat on the map table. "Do you understand what Pelwin will do with that information? What Voss's people will do with it? You have handed every political enemy this family has a weapon sharp enough to end. I have brought you an alliance offer from the most militarily capable sovereign on the continent," she said, and held out the paper. He looked at it. He didn't take it immediately. "Read it," she said. "Then tell me what Pelwin will do with what I've handed the family." He took the paper, unfolded it, read it. She watched his face while he read. She knew how to do that, had been watching her father's face over documents since she was old enough to understand that documents were where the family's real life happened. More than meals, more than conversation. She watched his eyes move down the page, and she watched the particular sequence of micro-expressions. The initial political skepticism, the careful reassessment as the terms registered, the specific tightening around the eyes that happened when he hit something he hadn't anticipated. He read it twice. She was sure he read it twice because his eyes went back to the top when they reached the bottom, which they didn't always do. Then he looked up. "The last line," he said. "Yes." "He's requesting you at the table, personally, by name." "He is." "As a participating party." His voice was very controlled. "Not a subject of negotiation." "That's what it says." He set the paper down on the map table and looked at it as though it were a topographical feature he hadn't expected to encounter. "What happened in that forest, Seraphine?" He asked me questions about the Dominion's internal politics and the northern movements. I answered them. We talked through the strategic situation for most of the day. She paused. He listened. The word landed in the room with more weight than she had intended, or maybe exactly the weight she had intended. Her father looked at her with an expression that was complex in the way that only expressions are complex when they contain things the person hasn't decided yet whether to say. "Darius Voss is in the south wing," he said. "I'm aware. He arrived 2 hours ago. He is expecting a ceremony. He has brought 40 members of his household, 3 legal advisors, and the formal documentation for the alliance contract." Her father's voice was precise and entirely without dramatic inflection, which was how she knew he was operating in the register that meant he was managing something close to the outer edge of his composure. "He also brought his mother." She absorbed this. His mother. Lady Orvana Voss, 70 years old and the sharpest political mind in the Southern Territory. She sat down in the blue receiving room and has been drinking tea and asking my staff very specific questions for the past 2 hours. He looked at the paper again. "She is not a woman who will accept a quiet dissolution." "No," Seraphine said. "I imagine she isn't." He looked at her directly. "If I cancel this ceremony, I make an enemy of the southern frontier. I lose the river crossings. I damage the Dominion's credibility with every house that has been watching this match take shape for 8 months, and who will now conclude that the Veilers cannot honor their commitments. Unless," she said carefully, "the reason the ceremony is cancelled is that you have secured a superior alliance with a more strategically significant partner, in which case the same houses will conclude that the Veilers are shrewd rather than unreliable. The calculation depends entirely on whether I can actually secure that alliance," he said. "An unsigned piece of paper from a king who is currently camped in the Vale Thorn with 2 soldiers is not a treaty." "No," she said. "It's an opening." He was quiet, his hands still pressed flat on the map. The morning light through the war room's high windows hit the maps at an angle that picked out the river crossings in the south and the border notation in the northeast that indicated the edge of Ashravan territory. And she thought about the fact that those 2 things were both on the same map and had always been on the same map, and for 8 months everyone in this room had been looking at only one of them. "I need to meet with him," her father said finally. "I know. Here, formally, with proper documentation and his senior advisors present, not 2 soldiers and a campfire. I'll arrange it." He looked at her sharply. "You'll arrange it." "I'm the participating party," she said, and held his gaze without apology. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not pleasure. Something older and more complicated than either of those. The expression of a man who is looking at something he has been looking past for a long time. "Go clean up," he said, "and stay away from the south wing." She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Seraphine." She stopped. "Are you all right?" She thought about the honest answer, which was multifaceted and would take longer than either of them had in this moment. She gave him the accurate one instead. "I am better than I was 2 days ago," she said. She left the paper on the table. Chast. She had been back in her rooms for less than an hour, long enough to wash her feet, change into clean clothes, send a rider back to the Valethorn clearing with a message for Ronan outlining the proposed formal meeting and its requirements. When the door opened without a knock, she had not locked it. She corrected that assumption about herself immediately afterward. She had not locked it because she had been in her father's house for 22 years and had never needed to. Pelwin stood in the doorway. He was not holding his folder. That was the first thing she noted, because Pelwin without his folder was like a soldier without his weapon. Technically the same person, but the absence changed the meaning of the presence. "Close the door," she said, because whatever this was, it didn't need the corridor. He did. Then he stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 22 years of watching it. And what she saw there was not the professional neutrality she associated with him, not the political calculation she had come to read as easily as text. What she saw there was something colder and more personal and considerably more dangerous than either of those things. "The High Elder is going to ruin himself," he said. "My father is going to expand the Dominion's strategic position significantly," she said. "I understand some people find those two things indistinguishable. You don't know what you've walked into." His voice was very flat. "You spent one day in a forest with a man who told you what you wanted to hear. You have come back carrying a piece of paper and the conviction that you understand the shape of the continental situation." He took a step into the room. "You are 22 years old." "I'm aware of how old I am," she said. "Then act like it." Something in his voice had changed, shifted from contained to something with an edge to it, a heat she had not heard from him before. The Voss alliance was 8 months of careful negotiation, 8 months of managing houses, managing expectations, managing the legal framework for the river crossing access. Every political relationship the Dominion has maintained in the South is predicated on that contract being signed. And an Ashravan alliance is predicated on the contract not being signed, she said. The mathematics aren't difficult. The mathematics assume Ronan Ashravan is negotiating in good faith. She looked at him. The way she was looking at him had changed. She had come into this conversation watching him the way she always watched him, with the habitual wariness of someone who has never quite trusted a thing but has accommodated it. Now she was watching him differently. Now she was watching for something specific. "Why would he not be?" she said. "Because he is a sovereign who operates at continental scale," Pelwin said, and his voice had steadied again, moved back to the cooler register. "And the Dominion is a regional power whose primary value to him is the southern river crossings, which he can access through an alliance with Voss just as easily as through an alliance with your father, or through military pressure, or through any number of approaches that do not require him to hand a 22-year-old noblewoman a piece of paper calling her a participating party." He paused. "I have to ask myself what he gains by elevating you in that specific way." The room was very quiet. She felt the thing he was implying land in her chest the way cold water lands. Not painful, but shocking, the shock that comes before you've determined whether the cold is going to hurt you. "Say what you're saying," she said. "I'm saying that a man who wants to destabilize an arranged marriage has very effective tools available to him, and that a young woman who feels unseen is one of those tools." He held her gaze. "I'm saying that the Veilthorn conversation may have been exactly what it appeared to be, or it may have been the most elegant diplomatic manipulation I've observed in 20 years of watching diplomacy happen, and I'm saying that you are not positioned to know which one it was." The silence stretched. She wanted to reject it immediately and cleanly, the way you reject something that threatens something you've already decided matters. The instinct rose in her the way instincts rise, fast and warm and certain. She made herself sit with it instead. She made herself consider it honestly, the way she had been trained to consider evidence before she committed to a conclusion, the way she had read those intelligence reports without deciding what they meant before she'd finished reading. She made herself apply the same standard to the things she most wanted to be true, which was always the hardest and most necessary test. The terms on the paper were real. The conversation at the stream had been real. He had asked real questions and listened to real answers and written in her name as a participating party. All of that could also be architecture. She breathed. "Leave," she said. Pelwin didn't move immediately. He looked at her with an expression that was, and this surprised her, not triumphant. It was something that might, in a different man, have been close to regret. "The Voss wedding proceeds tomorrow morning unless the High Elder cancels it," he said. "Lord Darius has indicated he is willing to discuss a modified timeline, but not a dissolution. His legal team has prepared a formal objection to any delay." He paused. "Think carefully about what you've brought home from that forest." He left. The door clicked. She stood in the middle of her room and breathed. Boink. The writer she had sent to the Veilthorn came back at midday with a response from Ronan. A single line in the same compact handwriting. Formal meeting confirmed. Tomorrow, first light. I will bring kale and documentation. Tomorrow, first light. The same hour as the wedding. She stood at her window and looked at that for a long time. It was possible, she made herself walk through it clearly, that the line was coincidence. He had agreed to her timeline without knowing the wedding's specific timing. She had not told him when the ceremony was scheduled. It was also possible it was not coincidence. She thought about Pelwin's face when he had not held his folder. She thought about the way the terms on the paper were perfectly calibrated for what the Dominion needed, and the specific language her father's advisors would find most compelling, as though they had been written by someone who understood the Dominion's internal political language as well as its strategic position. She thought about the wolf finding her in the forest. She thought about how the clearing had been 60 feet from the deer path that her father's hunters used regularly, which was information Ronan would have had if he'd spent any time evaluating the Dominion's eastern border terrain as he claimed. She thought about all of it, and she did not dismiss any of it, and she did not accept any of it as conclusion, and the thing she arrived at was the same thing she always arrived at when the evidence was genuinely uncertain. She needed more information. She needed it from a source that was neither Ronan nor Pelwin. She found Hadwin in his office late afternoon, which was where he was at this hour every day when the estate was in residence, and she sat down across from him without being invited because there wasn't time for the usual forms. "Tell me what you know about Ronan Ashravan," she said. "Not the diplomatic file, what you actually know." Hadwin looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is moderately surprised it arrived this quickly. He set down his pen. "What prompts the question?" "Pelwin came to my room." His expression moved. "What did he say?" "He suggested the Veilthorn conversation might have been strategic manipulation." She held Hadwin's gaze. "I want to know if there's a basis for that assessment." Hadwin was quiet for a long moment. He had the quality of someone composing something carefully before speaking, the way you compose something when the words have to be precise because there isn't room for correction later. "Ronan Ashravan," he said slowly, "has in 4 years taken a kingdom that was militarily strong but diplomatically isolated and built it into an empire with alliances on 3 fronts. The method he has used consistently is direct engagement at an unexpected level, approaching the person in a situation who is undervalued but actually most capable, rather than the person who holds the formal authority." He paused. "He has done this 5 times that our intelligence has documented. 4 of those times the alliance succeeded. 1 failed when the undervalued party was ultimately overruled by their family structure." She felt the cold move through her carefully. "He has a pattern." "He has a method," Hadwin said, with the distinction that mattered. Whether it is manipulation or simply accurate assessment of where actual capability resides is a question that may not have a clean answer. He looked at her steadily. "The outcome of his 4 successful alliances has, by every metric we have, been beneficial to both parties. The partners he identified as capable were in fact capable. That doesn't tell me whether he saw me or whether he was engineering a situation." "No," Hadwin said, "it doesn't." He folded his hands on the desk. "But I'll tell you what I do know. He could have returned you to the estate boundary yesterday morning and approached your father through formal channels, which would have been slower but not impossible. He did not do that. Pelwin says that's the manipulation. Pelwin," Hadwin said very quietly, "has spent 8 months managing the Voss alliance and has significant personal and political capital invested in it completing." He let that sit for exactly the right duration. "I am not saying his concern is false. I am saying it is not disinterested." She sat with that. "What would you do?" she said, "in my position?" Hadwin looked at her with the full attention of someone who is choosing to answer honestly because they have decided the person across from them has earned it. "I would go speak to Ronan Ashravan directly," he said, "not through writers and messages. Directly. Tonight. And I would ask him the thing you're afraid to ask him, because the answer, whatever it is is the only information that will actually help you decide. Holtz. She went at dusk, with a single escort she trusted and without telling Pelwyn or her father where she was going, and the veil thorn took her in the way it had taken her the morning before, with the massive, indifferent patience of something that does not need to mean anything to be significant. Ronan was at the fire. He stood when she entered the clearing, and she saw in his face the assessment she had come to recognize. Not startlement, but recalibration, the reading of a new data point, the question forming before he asked it. "Something changed," he said. "Pelwyn came to my rooms," she said. "He suggested the Veilthorn conversation was a diplomatic strategy, that you have a documented method of identifying undervalued parties in political situations and cultivating them as alliance leverage." She said it cleanly, without flinching from it, because flinching would have contaminated the information she was trying to get, which was his unguarded response to a direct accusation. She watched his face. What she saw was not guilt, which would have been simple, not indignation, which would have been performance. What she saw was something that looked very much like a man who has been asked a fair question and is deciding whether to answer it with the fairness it deserves. He was quiet for long enough that she counted her own breaths. 3 of them. "He's right," Ronan said. The fire crackled. "I have a method," he said. "I have used it consistently. I identify who in a political structure holds the actual capacity, regardless of their formal position, and I engage there rather than at the title. I did that here." He looked at her directly. "Everything I told you about the strategic situation was true. The terms I offered are real. The assessment I made of your capacity was accurate. It was not manufactured to flatter you. It was a conclusion I reached based on evidence." "But the approach was engineered," she said. "Yes," he said. "You chose to engage me specifically because I was in a position you could use. I chose to engage you because you walked into the Veilthorn alone at dawn and followed a wolf through old-growth forest, and then sat down across a campfire from a stranger and answered his questions with more strategic clarity than most of my senior advisors manage in formal briefings." He held her gaze with the flat steadiness she had come to understand was not coldness, but precision. "That I also needed what you could provide doesn't make what I saw untrue." The clearing was very quiet. She looked at him across the fire and felt the thing she had been afraid of confirming, now confirmed, settle into her chest and stay there, not collapsing into grief, not burning into anger, just sitting there with the dense weight of a truth that is more complicated than either the best or worst version of itself. He had seen her. He had also needed her. Both things were real. And there was no version of this conversation that would separate them into clean and uncomplicated pieces. "What I don't know," she said finally, and her voice was steadier than she expected, "is whether what you felt in this clearing was only one of those things or both of them." He looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked into this clearing the morning before, she watched something shift in Ronan Ashravan's face that was not controlled, not professional, not the deliberate stillness of someone managing their own presentation. He opened his mouth, and that was when Kale's voice cut across the clearing from the eastern edge, sharp and short, the specific sound of a soldier communicating emergency in minimum syllables. "Riders, fast, Voss colors." Ronan moved before the words finished, and Seraphine moved because everything in her understood immediately that Voss riders in the Veilthorn at dusk meant that Pelwyn had not come to her room only to warn her. He had come to her room to confirm her location, and now Lord Darius Voss, who had come to the estate expecting a bride, was coming to the forest to collect one. She looked at Ronan. He looked at her. And in the space between them was every unanswered question and every true thing and every complicated piece of a situation that was no longer something she could think her way through carefully, because the horses were close enough now that she could hear them, and the choice in front of her was no longer whether to trust him. It was whether to stand beside him. The horses broke through the eastern tree line at a dead run. Not a measured advance, not a formal approach with torches held high and banners declared. A hard, fast charge through the undergrowth, branches cracking, and Seraphine counted the riders before her mind had consciously decided to count them. 8, 10, 14, all of them armed, the Voss crest on their chests catching the last of the evening light like hammered copper. Ronan said, "Bren." One word. Bren was already moving, a short sword drawn, positioning to the left of the fire with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed crisis so many times it had stopped being crisis and become choreography. Kale took the right, same movement, same economy. 2 men against 14. Seraphine understood, in the cold, clear way she understood things when she stopped allowing herself to feel them before she'd processed them, that this was not a retrieval force. Aldrich's riders had been retrieval. Controlled, formal, the structure of a family's authority trying to reassert itself. This was something older and less formal than that. This was a man who had come to collect what he believed he owned and had decided to dispense with the architecture of permission. Lord Darius Voss pulled his horse up at the clearing's edge. She had seen him 3 times. At the formal introduction dinner 8 months ago, at a Dominion summit in the spring, and once at a distance during a military review her father had hosted. Each time he had struck her as exactly what he was described as: capable, controlled, the kind of man whose authority read as natural because he had never in his adult life encountered a situation in which it was seriously contested. He was encountering one now, and the way he looked at the clearing told her that the experience was genuinely unfamiliar to him, and that this was making him dangerous in the specific way that unfamiliarity makes capable men dangerous. His eyes moved across the space. Bren, Kale, the fire, the wolf standing at the lean-to's edge with her attention fixed on the horses with the absolute stillness of something deciding. And then settled on Ronan, and then on her, standing beside Ronan with 3 feet of firelit air between them. "Lady Seraphine," Voss said. His voice was controlled. That was the thing she noted first. A man who had ridden hard through a forest at dusk with 14 armed riders and arrived still sounding controlled. "Your father is waiting for you." "My father knows where I am," she said. A short pause. His jaw moved. "Your father's counselor informed me of your location." He looked at Ronan without addressing him, which was its own statement, denying Ronan the acknowledgement that acknowledging him would have required. "The ceremony has been delayed long enough." "The ceremony," Ronan said, very quietly, "has been superseded." Voss looked at him then. He couldn't help it because the voice commanded it, and commanding attention without raising volume was a skill that Voss recognized because it was one he used himself, and encountering it in someone else in his current situation produced in his face a series of micro-expressions that resolved into something careful and very cold. "King Ashravan," he said. The title delivered with precision. Not deference, identification. "You are in the Dominion's territory." "I am in the Vale Thorn," Ronan said, "which is claimed by no authority, as every map of the region notes. You're welcome to check the notations." "I'm here for the High Elder's daughter." "The High Elder's daughter is here of her own choosing." "She was here of her own choosing yesterday," Voss said, and the control in his voice had thinned by a degree, a wire being pulled tighter. "At present, she is a woman whose father has a legal contract with my house, and who has spent the night in a forest camp with a foreign sovereign. The Dominion's council will have a great deal to say about the nature of that choice." Seraphine felt the shape of what he was doing, the implication structured not as accusation but as consequence, so that she was not being called compromised. She was being informed that others would call her compromised, and that the distinction between the two was irrelevant to her practical situation. It was a sophisticated lever, and he was applying it with the precision of someone who had used sophisticated levers his entire political life. She felt something move through her at that. Not fear. Something that moved below fear, in the deeper register where survival calculus runs, where the body decides before the mind arrives. 14 riders, she said, and her voice came out level in a way that surprised her. "In the Vale Thorn at dusk is not a legal proceeding, Lord Darius." "No," he said. "It's a husband collecting his wife." "I am not your wife." "You will be by noon tomorrow." The fire popped. One of the horses shifted, and its rider pulled it back to stillness, and the clearing held the particular charged silence of a situation that has reached the edge of what words can manage and is waiting to discover what comes next. Ronan stepped forward. One step, unhurried, into the firelight and toward Voss's horse, and Seraphine watched 14 hands move to 14 weapons with the collective reflex of trained soldiers responding to a perceived threat, and she watched Ronan register all 14 of those movements with a glance that held no alarm at all, just information, the way a commander reads a battlefield, not asking whether the danger is real, but calculating what the danger means for the next decision. He stopped when he was close enough that Voss had to look down at him, which meant Voss was looking down, and Ronan was not looking up in the way that people look up at people on horses, head tilted, neck exposed. He was looking at Voss with his chin level and his shoulders loose and the fire at his back, and the quality of the looking was such that the height differential stopped mattering in a way that was technically inexplicable and practically undeniable. "You rode 14 armed men through the Veilthorn at dusk," Ronan said, "to collect a woman who walked here voluntarily. I want to make sure I understand your position correctly before I respond to it." "My position," Voss said, "is clear. Your position is that you have a legal contract. Contracts are written between parties with the authority to enter them. Lady Seraphine is not party to your contract. She is its subject. There is a difference." He paused for exactly the right duration. "I am offering the Eastern Dominion a military alliance and trade framework that materially exceeds what your river crossings provide. Your contract's value to the Dominion is geographic. Mine is strategic. The High Elder is a man who understands the distinction." Something cracked in Voss's control. It didn't break. He was too experienced for it to break. But it cracked. And through the crack came something that had been behind the control the whole time, hot and personal, less political than he probably would have preferred in this moment. "You are in my territory negotiating my contract using my intended bride as your intermediary," he said, "and you're standing in front of me explaining legal distinctions." "I'm standing in front of you," Ronan said, "because you rode into this clearing with 14 armed men, and I want you to be very clear about what you're looking at before you decide what comes next." Voss looked at the two soldiers flanking the clearing. He looked at the wolf, who had not moved, whose attention on the horses had the quality of something calculating distances. He looked at Ronan. He did the math. Seraphine watched him do it. Watched him calculate that 14 against 3 was favorable odds, that the Veilthorn's darkness and terrain reduced the advantage somewhat, but not decisively, that the wolf was an unknown variable, but not necessarily a lethal one, that Ronan without armor and with only a field knife was physically vulnerable in a way that a man with 14 armed riders could reasonably exploit. She also watched him calculate the consequence. A King Alpha injured or killed in the Veilthorn during an altercation over a political marriage. The Ashravan Empire's response to that event. His name on every report that followed, every diplomatic communication, every military briefing on the continent for the next decade. The math resolved. His jaw set. He gathered his reins. "The High Elder will hear about this conversation," he said. "He will," Ronan said, "in detail. From me. Tomorrow at first light, in a formal meeting that Lady Seraphine has already arranged." He held Voss's gaze without aggression and without concession. "I look forward to presenting the Dominion's strategic options to him directly." Voss looked at Seraphine one last time. The look was not anger. It was something colder and more final than anger. The look of a man who is storing something, filing it, deciding that this is not the end of a thing, but the beginning of a different kind of pursuit. "Lady Seraphine," he said, "think carefully." "I have been," she said. "It's how I ended up here." He turned his horse. His riders parted and reformed behind him, and the sound of 14 horses moving back through the trees was different from the sound of their arrival. Controlled now, deliberate. The sound of a withdrawal that is not a retreat because a retreat admits defeat, and Darius Voss was not a man who admitted anything yet. The clearing released its held breath. Bren said, "He'll go to the High Elder tonight." "Yes," Ronan said. "If the High Elder sides with the contract, he won't." Seraphine said it, and both of them looked at her, and she looked back at them with the specific steadiness of someone stating a conclusion they've reached through evidence rather than hope. "My father is a political animal. What just happened in this clearing will reach him before Voss does. Hadwin will make sure of that. And my father will spend the next 4 hours reading the Ashravan terms again and calculating what 14 riders in the Vilethorn means about the nature of the Southern Frontier Alliance he almost committed to. Bren looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Seraphine. You trust Hadwin, he said. I trust Hadwin's instincts about which way situations are tilting, she said. He survived 3 High Elders by being right about that more consistently than anyone else. She looked at the tree line Voss had disappeared through. Pelwyn told Voss where to find me. Hadwin will tell my father that Pelwyn told Voss where to find me. Those 2 pieces of information, reaching my father simultaneously with Voss's complaint, will tell my father something significant about the quality of advice he's been receiving. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then, You've thought this through? I've had approximately 40 minutes since Pelwyn left my room, she said. I don't know that I've thought it through so much as I've thought through the pieces I can see. There are pieces I can't see. There always are, he said. She looked at him. The question she had come here to ask was still sitting between them, unanswered when Cale's voice had cut the conversation in half. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a stone in your boot. Not incapacitating, but present in every step. You were about to answer me, she said, when Cale called out. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. She had noted he never pretended not to know things, which was either honest character or very sophisticated performance, and she had spent 2 days trying to tell the difference and had concluded that the distinction might be less important than she had originally assumed. I was, he said. Then answer me now. Bren had moved back to the lean-to with the discretion of a man who understood when proximity was unhelpful. Cale was at the clearing's eastern edge, watching. The fire had settled to a low burn. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. Both things are true, he said. I have a method. I used it. I identified you as the capable party, and I engaged there, and I would make that same decision again in the same situation because it is consistently the right decision to make. He paused. Those things are also completely separate from what happened here. How can they be separate, she said, if one produced the other? Because the method produces a meeting, he said. What happens in the meeting is not the method. What I heard at that stream, your analysis, your thinking, the specific way you hold contradictory information without flattening it, that is not something I could have engineered by being present and asking questions. That is what you actually are. He held her gaze with the steadiness she had been reading for 2 days, and understood now was not flatness, but density. A man who had compressed considerable feeling into very controlled containment and was choosing carefully how much to release. And yes, both of those things have meaning to me. That is also true. The fire moved between them. She felt the thing she had been refusing to feel since Pelwyn's room settle into her chest, not as a weight, but as a clarification. The sensation of something coming into focus, not easier, but clearer, and clear was what she could work with. We have until first light, she said. Yes. And my father will either receive us in the morning or he won't. Yes. And if he doesn't, then I approach through formal channels. It takes longer, and the outcome is less certain, Ronan said, with the same unhesitating directness he had used about everything. I told you that 2 nights ago, and it remains true. And the wedding? And the wedding, he confirmed, and nothing in his face moved away from her when he said it. She sat down beside the fire. He sat across from it, and they kept the same vigil they had kept the night before, except that the night before she had been deciding whether to go back, and now the direction of everything had shifted. She was going back in the morning, the question resolved, and what sat between them now in the fire's low warmth was not strategy, but the specific, complicated human weight of 2 people who have been honest with each other in a clearing for 2 days and understand that the morning will require them to be something more formal than honest, at least for a while. Your father, she said after a long quiet. What was he like? He looked at her. The question had clearly not been expected. Effective, he said after a moment. Harder than I am. He would not have had this conversation with you. Which conversation? Any of them, he said. He would have sent an envoy, a formal document. He would have engaged your father directly as the power in the situation and dismissed your capacity as irrelevant to his purpose. He paused. He was not wrong that it was an efficient approach, but he spent his life negotiating with the formal holders of power and then watching his alliances erode because the formal holders of power are not always the ones who determine what the power actually does. She thought about her father's desk, the report she had written that had sat there unread. "So you learned from watching that fail?" "I learned from watching the pattern," he said. "People in power structures are almost never the only capable ones in them. They're just the ones the structure has decided to acknowledge." She looked at the fire. "Is that why you wrote the last line?" He knew which line. She could see that he knew. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. "You need to know," she said carefully, "that if my father agrees tomorrow, if the alliance moves forward, I will not be managed, not by you, not by the arrangement, not by whatever the formal structure decides my role should be. If I'm at the table, I'm there to actually be at the table." "I know," he said. "I mean it specifically." "I know that too." He met her eyes directly. "I wrote the line because I meant it. Not as a concession, as a requirement." The fire crackled, low and steady. Somewhere above them in the dark, the canopy moved. She thought about the slippers by the gate, how she had set them down deliberately, both of them, neat and careful, not thrown. Set down, like a closing statement. She thought about the wolf at dawn in the old forest, looking at her with pale, clear eyes, and deciding something that animals decide through different mechanisms than people do, but which amounts to the same thing. This one is worth the attention. She thought about what Hadwin had said. "Go ask him the thing you're afraid to ask." She had asked it, he had answered it, and the thing she had been afraid of, that the answer would be yes, that the method and the meaning were the same thing, that she had been handled after all in the most sophisticated possible way, had turned out to be yes in a manner that somehow did not produce the outcome she had expected, because the yes was accompanied by something else that the yes could not contain, something that existed outside the method the way the forest existed outside the map's clean edges. She did not know what to do with that yet. She suspected she would know in the morning. Dud. First light came the way first light comes after a sleepless night. Not gradually, but suddenly, the dark giving way all at once to a gray that became gold, the forest detail returning as though someone had slowly increased the aperture until the whole world came sharp again. She stood up, her back ached from the lean-to's hard angle, her feet were cold. Ronan was already at the fire, adding wood, and he looked up when she moved and she saw on his face the same lack of sleep she was carrying, the same quality of having stayed fully present through the night rather than resting in any of it. And something in that shared wakefulness felt more honest than any of the words they'd exchanged. The way two people who have stayed awake for the same thing understand each other without requiring the thing to be named. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," he said. Bren and Kale were saddling the horses. The wolf rose from her position at the lean-to and shook herself once and looked at Seraphine with those pale eyes, and Seraphine thought, not for the first time, that the wolf had known something in the forest at dawn 2 days ago that she herself had not yet understood, and that this was either a poetic thought or evidence that she was running on no sleep, and probably both. They rode out of the Vale Thorn as the light went full gold. The estate was already visible at the end of the south road, and visible at the estate's front gates were riders, her father's formal household guard, 12 men in Valer livery, which was the formation used for official diplomatic reception, not retrieval. Not crisis management. Reception. She felt something loosen in her chest. Hadwin was at the gate on foot, and he looked at the approaching riders and then specifically at Seraphine, and gave her a look that contained, in its compressed economy, a full report. "I told him." He listened. "Pelwin has been removed from this morning's proceedings. Voss is in the East Wing and very unhappy. Your father is ready." She read all of that from 12 feet away and breathed. The gates opened, and they rode through into the estate's courtyard, and the household guard formed a corridor of formal reception, and High Elder Kadeen Valer stood at the head of it in his full formal attire, with the expression of a man who has made a decision before he slept, and has woken up more certain of it than he was when he made it. And he looked at his daughter and then at the King Alpha beside her and then at his daughter again. He gave one single nod. It was a small gesture. It contained everything. She felt it move through her the way certainty moves through you, when you've been carrying uncertainty so long that its absence is a physical sensation, relief and steadiness, and the particular warmth of being right about someone you needed to be right about. She was about to dismount when the door to the east wing opened. Lord Darius Voss stepped out. He was in full formal dress. Behind him, his mother, Lady Orvina, small and white-haired, and with eyes that had not softened with age, but had simply focused themselves into something that looked very much like a weapon. And behind her, 3 legal advisors carrying heavy leather cases. Voss looked at the courtyard, at the reception formation, at Ronan, at Seraphine, at her father, standing at the corridor's head with a posture that said, without requiring translation, that the decision had already been made and that he was not in the courtyard to negotiate it. And what moved across Darius Voss's face in that moment was not the hot crack she had seen in the Veilthorn clearing, not the personal, barely contained thing that lived beneath his control. What moved across his face was something older and colder and considerably more deliberate. He was not accepting this. She could see that clearly. She could see it in the way his stance organized itself, in the way his legal advisors spread fractionally behind him, in the way Lady Orvina Voss moved to her son's left with the unhurried precision of a woman who has spent 70 years positioning herself for difficult conversations and has never once done it wrong. Voss met Seraphine's eyes across the courtyard. "High Elder," he said, and his voice carried the entire space without raising. "Before this proceeds, I have a legal objection to present. Formal, witnessed." He held up a document. "The contract between House Voss and House Valor is binding under Dominion law. Its dissolution requires either mutual agreement or a determination of breach." He paused. "I am prepared to demonstrate breach." The courtyard was absolutely still. Seraphine felt the cold move through her again. And this time, it was not the cold of uncertainty, but of calculation. She understood immediately what breach meant, what he intended to demonstrate, what evidence he had that was also true and also complicated and also capable of reshaping this courtyard's careful formation into something entirely different. She looked at her father looked at Voss. And in the space between them, in the formal morning light of the Valor Estates courtyard, with 12 household guards and 3 legal advisors, and a king on horseback and a wolf watching from the gate, the thing that Seraphine had walked away from 2 mornings ago came back across the courtyard and stood in front of her and refused, with considerable legal expertise and a lifetime's worth of political capability, to simply be left behind. Ronan's voice came from beside her, quiet and level, as it had been in the Veilthorn clearing when 14 riders had broken through the trees. "High Elder," he said, "with your permission, I'd like to speak first." Her father looked at him, looked at Voss, looked at Seraphine. His hand rose, the formal gesture that in Dominion protocol meant the speaker has the floor, and that in this context meant something considerably larger than procedure. Ronan dismounted. He walked to the center of the courtyard without armor, without ceremony, without anything except the quality she had watched all day in the Veilthorn, and had not been able to name then and could name now. The authority of a man who has never needed the room to be arranged in his favor, because he had learned, at some cost, to arrange himself. He stopped in the center of the space. Every eye in the courtyard was on him, and for the first time since she had followed a wolf through an old forest and found a campfire and a king, Seraphine Valor understood that the moment she had walked toward 2 mornings ago barefoot and deliberate through a kitchen gate was not the moment that mattered. This was. Whatever came out of Ronan's mouth in the next 30 seconds would determine every border, every alliance, every life in 2 kingdoms for the next generation. She held her breath. He opened his mouth. Ronan spoke without preamble. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform confidence the way men perform it when they need the room to believe something that isn't yet established. The slightly expanded chest, the deliberate pause, the controlled theater of authority. He simply spoke. Into the courtyard's held silence, the way someone speaks when they have already decided that the truth is the most efficient instrument available. "High Elder Valor," he said, "Lord Voss has a legal document. I have a different kind of offer. I'll ask you to hear both before you decide which one matters more." He looked at Caedon Valor directly, not at the household guard, not at Voss. At the man who held the Dominion's actual authority and who was standing at the head of his own courtyard with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now watching the decision be tested in real time. The Northern Alliance is assembling, Ronan said, not as a theory in an intelligence briefing, as a physical fact. 4 weeks ago, my Eastern scouts tracked a supply movement through the Kelith Pass that indicates the first stage of a coordinated campaign is already in preparation. Not next year. This season, possibly before the first snow. He paused. Your counselors have this information in fragmented form. They have not assembled it correctly because they have been focused on the wrong question. The question they've been asking is whether the Northern movement is territorial. The correct question is whether it's designed to break apart the existing continental order entirely, because the answer to those two questions requires different responses. The courtyard was very still. Your daughter, he said, understood that distinction 8 months ago and wrote a summary of it that sat on your desk unread. I read her analysis yesterday beside a stream in the Vale Thorn. It is the most accurate assessment of the Northern situation that I have encountered from any source, including my own advisors. He let that land without decoration. An alliance between the Dominion and the Ashravan Empire, built on the terms I've proposed, closes the strategic vulnerability that the Northern campaign is designed to exploit. It does this more completely than the Voss River crossing arrangement because the Voss arrangement addresses the geographic question rather than the strategic one. Voss said, "This is a negotiation tactic dressed as Lord Voss." Caden Vaylor's voice cut across the courtyard with the quality of a man who has spent 3 decades exercising authority in his own house. "You will have your turn." Voss's jaw set. He did not speak again. Ronan looked at Caden without triumph and without calculation, and what Seraphine saw in his face from her position, still mounted at the courtyard's edge, was the thing she had spent 2 days learning to recognize. A man being exactly what he was, without the layers of performance that power usually requires, because he had learned through some hard earlier version of himself that stripping those layers down to the functional core was what actually worked. "I am not asking you to break a contract out of political convenience," Ronan said. "I am telling you that the contract you are about to sign will not protect the Dominion from what is coming. I am telling you that I can, and that the terms are on the paper your daughter is carrying." He turned and looked at Seraphine directly, across the courtyard, in full view of every person in it. "And I am telling you that the reason I know what your daughter's analysis is worth is because I asked her and I listened, which is apparently something the Dominion's political structure has not consistently done. That is a resource you have been underusing. I intend to correct that." The silence that followed was different from the charged silence before he had spoken. This one had texture. The silence of people processing rather than bracing. The silence of a situation that has tilted and whose tilt is only now being felt. Caden Vaylor looked at his daughter. She met his eyes and gave him the same thing she had given him in the war room. Not performance, not appeal, just her face as it actually was, with everything she had learned in 2 days in a forest, and one sleepless night written clearly in it for anyone who was paying the right kind of attention. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Voss. "Lord Darius," he said, "present your document." Taped. Voss's legal advisor was a compact man named Farron, who had the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered bad news to powerful people many times, and had learned to do it without telegraphing what was in the envelope. He stepped forward and opened the leather case and produced the document with the care of someone handling something he understood to be a weapon. "The contract between House Voss and House Vaylor," Farron said, "specifies binding agreement subject to formal dissolution only under conditions of mutual consent or demonstrated breach. House Voss has not consented to dissolution." He paused. "House Voss submits that a breach condition exists, specifically the contract's propriety clause, standard in all marital alliance documents under Dominion law, establishes that the betrothed party must maintain conduct appropriate to the alliance's dignity during the period between signing and ceremony." He did not say what the breach was. He did not have to. Every person in the courtyard understood what he meant, because Pelwyn had made sure of it. 12 riders dispatched to the Vale Thorn, the story already moving through the household's lower corridors. The particular shape of an implication that once introduced into a space cannot be withdrawn from it. Seraphine felt the thing land in her chest, not collapse. Something harder than collapse. The sensation of a structure being tested from the outside, the vibration moving through it, the question of whether it holds. Lady Orvana Voss had not moved from her position at her son's left. She was watching Seraphine with eyes that were entirely without hostility and entirely without mercy, the eyes of a woman who had navigated 70 years of political life and understood that the cleanest victories are the ones where you don't have to raise your voice. Kedin Vaylor's expression had not changed. Seraphine had been watching her father's face for 22 years, and she could not read what was behind his stillness, which meant he was operating at the deepest level of his own control, the level he used when the situation was serious enough that even his habitual micro-expressions were not available to anyone watching. She dismounted. She did it deliberately, swung down from the horse and stood on the courtyard stone with her feet flat and her spine straight and the paper still in her right hand, and she walked to the center of the courtyard and stood beside Ronan, not behind him, not deferring to the space his presence had already claimed, but beside him, 3 feet to his left, so that what the courtyard was looking at was 2 people standing in the same space with the same degree of solidity. She heard Lady Orvana make a small sound. Not surprise. Something colder than surprise. The propriety clause, Seraphine said, and her voice came out with the same quality she had heard in her father's voice her entire life, the compression of large things into a few carefully chosen words, applies to conduct that damages the alliance's dignity. I spent 2 days in the Veilthorn conducting a strategic negotiation that, if completed, will strengthen the Dominion's position more significantly than any alliance in the last generation. She looked at Farron directly. The conduct the document describes was diplomatic engagement. I am prepared to characterize it as such under any formal proceeding Lord Voss wishes to initiate. The characterization of the conduct, Farron said with professional neutrality, is precisely the point of dispute. Then dispute it, she said, in a formal proceeding, with full documentation, in front of every noble house in the Dominion and every diplomatic contact the Ashravan Empire maintains on the continent. She held his gaze. I'm curious how that proceeding will characterize Lord Voss dispatching 14 armed riders into the Veilthorn at dusk to retrieve a woman who had not yet married him. The silence was absolute. Farron looked at his document, then at Voss, then at his document again. Lady Orvana Voss said, very quietly, Darius. 1 word. The word contained a complete assessment of the situation and a recommendation and 70 years of hard-won understanding of when a position had become untenable, all compressed into a single name delivered in a tone that most people in the courtyard probably could not have heard, but that her son clearly could. Voss stood for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She had never thought he was. He was a man who had operated his entire life in a system that told him his authority was the correct authority, and he had internalized that deeply enough that the system's limits had become invisible to him, the way walls become invisible when you've lived inside them long enough. What he was doing now, she understood, was encountering those limits from the inside for the first time, and feeling the specific texture of a structure that he had always assumed was open space. He looked at Seraphine. For a moment, one single moment, she saw something in his face that was not the cold anger of a man whose position is being contested and not the political calculation of a man assessing his next move. She saw something more human and more uncomfortable than either of those. The specific expression of a man who is understanding, perhaps for the first time, that what he had organized in his mind as a natural order was not natural at all, but constructed, and that the woman standing in front of him had walked through the construction's weakness and out the other side. She did not feel triumph at that. She felt something more complex and less satisfying than triumph, something close to sorrow, because sorrow is what you feel when you understand that a person's limitation is genuine rather than performed, that they are not a villain, but a product, and that products of a broken system deserve some measure of grief even when they've used that system against you. High Elder, Voss said, and his voice was very controlled and very final. I withdraw the document. The words fell into the courtyard and stayed there. Kedin Vaylor breathed once, slowly. the breath of a man releasing something he has been holding carefully for a long time. "Lord Darius," he said, "the Dominion will honor the preparation costs your house has incurred, in full. Additionally, the Eastern Trade Road's expanded access will be formalized through a separate commercial agreement, not an alliance contract, a trade agreement between our houses as equals." He paused. "You have served the southern frontier with capability and consistency. That is not nothing. It will be acknowledged." Something moved through Voss's expression at that. She thought it might have been, underneath everything else, relief. The relief of a man being offered a way to leave with his capacity acknowledged rather than only his loss recorded. He looked at his mother. Lady Orvana gave him the smallest nod. He inclined his head to Kadeen Vaylor, one formal degree. Then he turned, and his household formed behind him, and Lord Darius Voss of the southern frontier walked out of the Vaylor estate's main courtyard with his legal advisors and his mother and his 40-person household, and the gate closed behind him, and the sound of it closing was not dramatic. It was simply final. Perceived. The signing took 3 hours. Ronan's documentation was with Kael, who produced it from a leather case with the professional calm of a man who had been prepared for this meeting since before Seraphine had walked into the Veilthorn. The terms were exactly as they had been written on the paper in the forest. No revisions, no additions designed to exploit the morning's advantage. Her father's advisors went through it line by line with Ronan's, and Seraphine sat at the table between them, not as an observer, and the quality of her presence at the table was different from anything she had experienced in her 22 years of watching these rooms function. No one asked her to leave. No one treated her contributions as overreach. Twice, her father looked at her before responding to a point raised by Ronan's side, the way you look at someone whose read you've decided to trust. And she gave him what she had, her honest assessment, in plain language, without the elaborate courtesy structures that political discussion usually required. The third time he looked at her, it was not about the document. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her very briefly in the war room, with the expression she had not been able to hold on to before it passed. It did not pass this time. He held it long enough that she felt it, and what she felt was complicated and earned and did not require either of them to speak about it, because some things are communicated most completely through the decision not to diminish them with words. Ronan signed first, then Kadeen, then Seraphine, in the space Ronan had indicated beside the participating party notation, in the handwriting she had been using since she was 8 years old, clear and deliberate and entirely hers. The ink dried. Day. The courtyard was empty by late afternoon. The Voss household had taken the South Road within an hour of the withdrawal, moving with the organized efficiency of a large household that had packed knowing it might not be unpacking here. The Dominion's household guard had returned to their posts. Her father's advisors had dispersed to their various offices to begin the work that a treaty signing generates. Communications to be drafted, houses to be informed, the Continental Diplomatic Network beginning to process the morning's shift like a vast slow organism registering a change in temperature. Pelwyn was gone from the estate. She did not know where and did not ask. She found Hadwin in his office at the end of the afternoon, in his chair, with the reading glasses off for once and his hands folded on the cleared desk in the posture of a man who has done the day's work and is now simply existing in the day's aftermath. He looked at her when she came in. He said nothing. She sat across from him and said nothing either for a moment. "You told him," she said finally, "about Pelwyn." "I told him that his first counselor had informed Lord Voss of your location in the forest," Hadwin said. "Yes." He could have seen that as loyalty. Pelwyn was trying to preserve the contract. "He could have," Hadwin agreed. "He didn't." She breathed. "Why not?" Hadwin looked at her with the measured attention of 60 years of observing people and thinking carefully about what he observed. "Because he has spent 22 years watching your mind and telling himself that the political structure required him to deploy it differently than he might have chosen if choice had been unconstrained. And I believe that when he read what you had written and heard what King Ashravan said in that courtyard about the report on his desk, something in him decided that the cost of the structure had finally exceeded the structure's value." He paused. "He is not a cruel man, your father. He is a man who built something real under hard circumstances and whose instincts about what real looks like are, in fact, generally accurate. He looked at her steadily. You have those instincts too. You've always known that. It was simply a matter of time and circumstance. She sat with that. Outside the window, the estate's east garden was going golden in the late light, the clipped hedges casting long shadows across the stone path. She thought about the garden and the fountain with no moss, and the gate that had been propped open by a kitchen boy who had not yet come back to secure it, and the cold of the morning under her bare feet, and how the thing she had been walking toward had not had a name when she walked toward it. It was beginning to have one now. She wasn't ready to speak it yet. "Thank you," she said to Hadwin, "for telling me to go ask him." Hadwin made a small sound that was not quite a dismissal. "I told you to go ask the thing you were afraid to ask," he said. "You're the one who went." She found Ronan at the estate's eastern wall as the sun finished its descent. He was looking at the Veilthorn's dark mass against the evening sky, which was the same thing she had been looking at from her window the morning before this one had begun. That dark, breathing wall of old trees against the Empire's edge. He heard her coming and did not turn immediately, and when he did turn, it was with the unhurried quality she associated with him now, a man who moved through time at his own pace because he had decided long ago that urgency was a resource to be managed rather than a constant condition. She stood beside him and looked at the tree line. "It's done," she said. "Yes. My father wants a formal summit within the month. Both delegations, full documentation, the secondary agreements about the trade routes. I'll send Cale back ahead to arrange my advisors," he said. "I'll need 2 weeks." She nodded. The evening air was cool and smelled of the same pine resin it had smelled of when she had crossed the lower field 2 mornings ago, and she thought about how 2 mornings ago felt both very recent and like something that had happened in a different configuration of the world before the current one had been established. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. When you wrote the last line on the paper, in the afternoon after the stream," she kept her eyes on the tree line, "you said you wrote it because you meant it, not as concession, as a requirement." She breathed once. "I need to know if you wrote it because you understood what the Alliance needed, or because you understood what I needed." He was quiet long enough that she could feel the quality of the quiet. Not evasion, not calculation. The quiet of a man actually looking at the inside of his own answer before he delivered it. "Both," he said. "The same way the method and what happened in the clearing were both true. Both things don't cancel each other. They compound." She looked at him then. "I have spent 4 years," he said, "building alliances, governing an empire, making decisions that affect hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom I will never meet, and trying to make those decisions with enough accuracy that the aggregate of them tends toward something worth having built." He looked at the tree line, and something in his expression had the quality she had learned to read as density, the compression of large things into small space. "In 4 years, I have not once sat beside a fire in the evening and found the specific kind of quiet that exists when you're with someone whose thinking you trust completely, not strategically, not politically." He paused. "Completely." She felt the words settle, not the warm cascade she might have expected, the feeling she associated with declarations in the formal sense, something quieter and more durable than that, the sensation of a true thing being said plainly, in the right light, without architecture around it. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that I don't know yet what I am building toward. I know what the treaty says. I know what the summit will require. I know that I will be at the table." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know yet what comes after that, between us, what shape it takes. I need time to understand what I'm choosing when I have room to choose it without a courtyard watching and a crisis requiring it." "Yes," he said, immediately and without deflation. "That's the correct thing to need." She blinked. "You've made 2 enormous decisions in 48 hours under significant pressure," he said. "Both of them were right. That doesn't mean the next decision should be made the same way." He held her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere. The summit is in 3 weeks. The treaty is signed. You have time." She felt something move through her chest that was, she thought, the specific sensation of being known accurately, Not the feeling you get when someone says what you want to hear, but the feeling you get when someone says what is true, and what is true happens to be something generous, and the generosity is not performance, but character. Ronan, she said. He waited. In the Veilthorn, on the first night. She looked at the darkening tree line. When you said both things can be true, the method and what happened in the clearing. Yes. I believe you, she said. I want you to know that. I didn't come to that belief easily, and I'm not giving it to you cheaply. But I believe you. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it had at the stream, stripped of everything that wasn't essential, just the sentence itself and its weight. I know it wasn't easy, he said. That's why it matters. The last light faded off the tree line. The Veilthorn went dark and present, the way it was at every dawn and dusk. That living darkness that predated every kingdom built at its edge and would outlast them all, indifferent and enormous and complete. She thought about the wolf. She had not seen the silver wolf since the courtyard morning. The wolf had been at the gate as they rode through and then had simply not been there afterward, the way the wolf moved, present when it mattered, absent when its presence was no longer what the situation required. She thought about being found in the forest at dawn, the pale clear eyes of an animal that had looked at her and decided something through whatever mechanisms animals use for deciding. And she thought about following, and she thought about how the entire shape of her life had reorganized itself around that following. Not because the wolf had led her somewhere specific, but because she had discovered in the act of following without certainty that following without certainty was something she was capable of, that it did not unmake her to move toward things she hadn't yet named. She had spent 22 years building walls against the feeling of being unmade, measuring herself against other people's requirements, containing her capacity in rooms that didn't have space for it. The walls had not been foolishness. They had been the correct response to the circumstances that had built them, the survival architecture of a woman living inside a structure that had decided her value before she had been given a chance to demonstrate it. But survival architecture, she understood now, is not meant to be permanent. It is meant to hold until the circumstances change. And the circumstances had changed. Not because the world had become easier or because the political structure had become less demanding, but because she had walked through a gate and followed a wolf and sat across a campfire from a man who had asked her real questions and built, in the space of 2 days, the foundation of something that did not require her to be smaller than she was. The architecture could come down, not all at once, not without care, because walls that have held for a long time do not come down cleanly, and the rubble requires attention. But it could come down, piece by piece, in the time she had asked for, in the space between the treaty signed and the summit arranged and the next question posed, and she would know what she was building in the place of it when she could see the ground clearly. I should go back in, she said. My father will want to speak tonight. Yes, Ronan said. He did not suggest accompanying her. He understood, she had come to recognize, the difference between presence that supports and presence that crowds, and he exercised that understanding with a precision that she thought probably had a cost in it. The discipline of restraint has a cost, and people who practice it well are usually people who have learned that cost at some specific moment in their past. She turned to go. Seraphine? She stopped, looked back. He was still facing the tree line, and he said it to the darkness rather than to her face, which she understood was its own form of honesty. The way you say things to the dark that are harder to say to a face. I meant what I said in the courtyard, he said, about the report on your father's desk. That was not diplomacy. She held that. I know, she said. She went back through the garden, past the fountain, past the hedges shaped into forms that pleased the family's eye, into the light of the house where her father was waiting. Her feet on the stone were steady. Her hands were steady. The treaty was signed, and the summit was coming, and Lord Darius Voss was on the south road, and Pelwyn was gone, and Hadwin was in his office, and the wolf was somewhere in the Veilthorn, moving through old darkness with her particular unconcerned gravity. She walked through the hall to her father's study and knocked on the door and heard him say, "Come in," and she went in, and they sat across from each other in the room where the intelligence reports had lived for years, and she had read them without being asked to. He said, "I read your analysis, the full one. Hadwin found the copy you kept." She said, I know you did. You referenced it twice in the summit discussion without citing it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he made a sound that was, incredibly, almost a laugh. The short, surprised sound of a man caught in something small and true. You're going to be very difficult to govern, he said. You haven't been governing me, she said. You've been governing around me. There's a difference. She held his gaze. I'd like to stop requiring that accommodation. He breathed slowly. His hands were flat on the desk, the same posture as the war room, and she watched him look at her with the fullness she had seen twice now. Not the assessment of a political operator evaluating an asset, but the look of a man seeing his daughter with the specific clarity that comes from having almost lost the version of her that was most actually her. The summit, he said finally. You'll be present, formally, as my representative in the strategic discussions. He paused. Not as a consort, not as a diplomatic accessory, as a representative. Yes, she said. Pelwin's position will need to be filled, he said. His role, restructured. She understood what he was not quite saying. We can discuss that after the summit. Yes. He looked at the desk. Your mother will want to speak with you. I'll find her. She's going to tell you that you handled this recklessly, he said. She's going to be right and wrong simultaneously, which is the condition your mother often occupies. He looked up. She'll also tell you that she's proud of you, but not directly. Listen for the version where she tells you how like your grandmother you are. That's the same statement. Seraphine felt something move through her chest that was warm and complicated and entirely personal. The specific emotion of learning something small and true about someone you love, which is a different emotion from the large true things and in many ways more lasting. Get some sleep, her father said. The summit dispatches go out tomorrow. She stood. At the door she paused. The treaty, she said, the last line of the terms. The one about my participating seat. She didn't look back. He didn't add that for strategy. Her father was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. That's why I didn't negotiate it. She walked to her room. She stood at the window for a long time in the dark, looking east toward the Vale Thorns mass against the stars, and she thought about nothing specific and everything at once, which is the particular quality of mind that arrives when the enormous things have been decided and the smaller things have not yet begun, the held breath between one movement and the next. She thought about how she had set the slippers down by the gatepost, both of them, deliberate. The motion of someone who is not running but closing, drawing a line between the self that had stood on that platform in the fitting chamber while other people stitched their choices into her hem, and the self that had walked into the old forest and found her own name in the asking of it. She did not regret the slippers. She did not regret any of it. The difficulty or the uncertainty or the 2 nights without sleep or the courtyard's held breath or the thing she had not yet named that existed in the space between a fire and 2 people keeping watch beside it. She thought about what it would mean to build something, not to be built into something, but to build, with her own hands and her own thinking, and the hard-won clarity of knowing the difference between a person who sees you and a system that uses you, and choosing the former with the specific deliberateness of someone who has stopped confusing safety with life. The stars were clear over the Valethorn. Somewhere out in that old dark, a silver wolf moved through the trees. Seraphine Valor stood at her window and breathed, and felt the future arranged in front of her not as a corridor with walls, but as a country she had not yet walked, full of terrain she had not yet mapped, and found that the feeling of that, the unmapped fullness of it, was not frightening. It was the first honest thing she had felt in a very long time. She let it stay.